So what I want to talk today is what I call the framing of farming. Yeah, how do we think about farming in different contexts? And you'll see from the pictures there already, I have pictures from Africa, but also pictures from very high intensive, and on the right, that's very high intensive conservation agriculture. Yeah, so highly contrasting systems. So we're often hearing this issue, the food system's broken. We need to fix it. It's there in the World Economic Forum. It's there here from the Guardian newspaper, which is where I get my news. And that means it must be true. It must be true. So we think of them of this framing of farming, and we have these words: regenerative, organic, agroecological, traditional, indigenous, alternative, family farming. These are seen as very positive terms. Along opposite of that, we position that against industrial, large-scale, conventional farming, which is seen as something often very bad. But what do we mean by conventional agriculture? Actually, if we really look across the world, and there are several papers here that we can refer to later if I can share, if we ask the question, what is conventional agriculture? Well, nearly all farms in the world actually would come under the banner of conventional family farms. So there's a lot of discussion about how we frame, how we think about farming. It becomes very, very politicized in discussion and debates. So I wrote this paper on an agronomic perspective of regenerative agriculture in 2021. And this symbol here just shows how much it's been picked up and cited in the popular media and in the academic press. It's been very, very much a highly cited paper, published actually in rather an obscure journal. We started with this idea then that agriculture in crisis, the collapse of soil health, the extinction of biodiversity, plateauing crop yields, and against this, we get this call for regenerative agriculture, which would address these problems. But what is it? And that's what we go into the paper, and that's what I'll describe here. So if we look at regenerative agriculture, we can see there was virtually no discussion or mention of regenerative agriculture until about 2017. So really the last 5 years, it's just taken off exponentially. And I heard about regenerative agriculture first in a discussion of an advisory board for Unilever that I sit on. What's regenerative agriculture? I'm a professor of agriculture. I should know. I had no idea what they were talking about. So we did a historical review. And we found then that it was being used by everybody. The Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, as we're here together today, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, but also multinational companies, Danone, Olam, Kellogg's, Unilever, Nestle, PepsiCo, the World Council for Sustainable Business Development, everybody. Charitable foundations, the IKEA Foundation, big program on regenerative agriculture, and then farmers, and particularly when you look into it, livestock farmers on very large farms in North America and in Australasia, Australia and New Zealand. It's really taken over everywhere. Here we are, Nature Conservancy, the next revolution under our feet. We've got farmers starring in a regenerative agriculture farm for Greenpeace. And then here, Nestle supporting regenerative agriculture, General Mills committing 1 million hectares to regenerative agriculture, Danone very early in the game, Unilever with 13 principles of regenerative agriculture. We have Patagonia, the clothing company, going into regenerative organic agriculture. And then these are firms, big firms, Olam, Natura, Kering. These are traders who trade very large volumes of agricultural products globally. And then PepsiCo here, coming in quite late in the game, actually committing 3 billion euros to regenerative agriculture to strengthen farming communities. So much noise, but what is it? Well, we actually went back and looked. It's a rather complicated graph, but here, these bars show the use of regenerative agriculture that we could find in books, basically. and that's regenerative agriculture. This one is regenerative farming. They're used interchangeably. But you can see from actually around 1980, really a taking off, but then declining after 1990 until we picked up again here. And that's positioned against other terms like organic farming, organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture here in the middle. But you can see sustainable agriculture is very popular and then has declined, but regenerative agriculture taking off after this early peak. So where did it come from? Well, we find the origins of regenerative agriculture in the organic farming movement. Robert Rodale, head of the Rodale Research Institute in the United States, was really the home of organic agriculture in the United States. And they talk about regenerative agriculture, looking at ways of increasing biological production, building in stability, biological stability, no impact on the environment, foods free of biocides, minimal reliance on non-renewable resources. And particularly Dick Harwood here, somebody I knew very well earlier in my career, looking at high degree of national self-reliance to close nutrient loops, to close through recycling. So these were their definitions, but very much pointing to organic agriculture. But more recently here, Diana Martin from the Rodale Institute, she cautioned, yeah, and this is 2019 already, it's becoming a new buzzword, regenerative agriculture. It's just becoming greenwashing. So they're, if you like, frightened of losing control over the term and the terminology. So what is regenerative agriculture? In our paper, we did this summary of the different principles and practices that can be thought of as being part of regenerative agriculture. And this is how they relate to these problems of soil health and problems of biodiversity. So top here, and very, very often, is minimum tillage, conservation agriculture. And I understand you've been discussing that already this morning. So ways of reducing tillage, and particularly conservation agriculture, focused very much, of course, on preventing soil erosion and soil loss. Also going along with that, maintaining soil cover, because if you have conservation agriculture, you also need a mulch to make sure that the soil is covered. This focus is then on building soil carbon, both in the soil, but also above the ground. So using organic inputs, relying more on biological cycles, fostering diversity with livestock integration, avoiding pesticides, and here also encouraging water percolation, which of course you get if you create a good soil cover. So many of these things are things that we would consider to be in normal agriculture, if you like, in typical, what we might call conventional agriculture, we would call good agricultural practice. Things like conservation agriculture, cover crops, etc. But some of them start to be rather what I'd call a bit on the fringe. Compost tea, inoculating soils and composts. Things like permaculture, which are very specific to certain types of agriculture. Things like the holistic grazing, which are thought of really as being rather fringe approaches. But you can see much of the focus is on soils and soil health, with less attention here to biodiversity. And then we find organizations coming along like the Carbon Underground. I think this is quite an incredible soup of different logos here. The Carbon Underground, central here, the Rodale Institute, but then alongside many of these companies, Danone, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, organic foods, different types. And particularly here, we see this movie, Kiss the Ground, which was very influential in promoting the soil, promoting the regenerative agriculture movement. So the Carbon Underground, of course, focuses on getting more carbon underground, as it would suggest. And here's from Kiss the Ground, we see that building healthy soil solves everything. They put everything down to healthy soil versus dead soil. What we do with regenerative agriculture is increasing carbon, water holding capacity, etc., compared with what you'd find in a dead soil. And we get then claims, and I understand somebody from Chico, California State University will be speaking today, the future of agriculture, learning about regenerative agriculture. But then some of these claims, and this is David Johnson's work with fungal-dominated compost, where he uses this bioreactor to make compost. He spreads this compost with only 3 to 5 kilos per hectare. And he claims you can get 25 times as much active compost, and you can store 10 metric tons of carbon per hectare, 20 to 50 times the currently observed carbon increase. But some of these claims, I'm afraid, they really go too far. This is simply not possible. We get claims here of Dr. Elaine's soil food web approach, where she claims you can increase crop production 150%, reducing chemical inputs completely and halving your irrigation needs, all based on learning more about soil and soil biology. And of course, it only costs $5,000 a course. And I know people who've signed up to this. But making claims here, claims which are really impossible to actually found, where you can't find publications to back these up in the refereed press. But then we find some kickback. Does overselling the potential of regenerative agriculture undercut its potential? Overselling the benefits. So a paper from the Rodale Institute in Carbon Underground said that we could sequester all of the CO2 emissions globally just by using regenerative agriculture. And that got some real strong kickback, including from scientists who are very supportive of regenerative agriculture, because it's simply claiming things which are not possible. And the reason is, what people are doing is, if we look here at the accumulation of carbon against years of management, this is from a paper of Philippe Bavet, you start then, if you change management, you increase inputs into soil with a very rapid uptake of soil carbon, but then that attenuates with time towards a new equilibrium. So on the right-hand graph, this is the rate of accumulation, 0.8 tons per hectare per year, very fast accumulation at the beginning, but dropping down to 0 over time. So these are temporal benefits, they're time-bound, and they don't actually continue. But what people have been doing, and we actually explored this in a paper which was published just this last year, which is also attracting a lot of attention, where we argue we should be looking at soil carbon, but not for the benefits of carbon sequestration, but for the benefits of maintaining soil and soil fertility. But we argue that the idea of sequestering carbon in soil has been vastly overplayed. Now, we do that with some very strong evidence where we compare 3 scenarios. What is often presented is this completely unrealistic scenario, which is where the sequestration rate stays constant. So basically you get an extrapolation from early rates of carbon sequestration into the future infinitely. If we then have a slow carbon decrease or a fast decrease in the rate of sequestration, then we end up with completely different potentials for carbon sequestration. So this is then, if you like, the opportunity space for carbon sequestration, where people are claiming that we would be up here in the top corner where C is, where actually we're somewhere down here, where there's a fast decrease in rates of accumulation. Now, alongside that, we've done a very detailed study of looking at the rate of carbon sequestration, carbon buildup, and whether that has an influence on crop yield. And here, red shows a negative effect, orange shows no effect, and blue shows a positive effect. And you can see across many, many different experiments, we can see no significant benefit or correlation between sequestering carbon and crop yield. And we argue in the paper that this is basically because we can't separate what comes first. We introduce a practice, which could often be a yield improving practice, so we get a better yield. If we have more yield, we have more input of carbon into the soil, which can build soil carbon. But does that then feed back to give more crop yield? Yeah. So some of these practices directly build soil carbon, but they're building yield at the same time. So it's really hard to unravel which comes first, the chicken or the egg. So our main points of critique of this framing of agriculture is first that agriculture is so diverse. There are so many different starting points that the challenges for agriculture depend on where you are and where you start. But very little attention is ever given to the starting points or the local context. And I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. Another critique is that all of the idea of agrochemicals tend to be bundled into one box, whereas the concerns for environmental and human health of fertilizers and pesticides are very different. Fertilizers, if used well, can be argued are environmentally benign. They're just nutrients. But pesticides, of course, are designed selectively to kill different types of organisms, and they have then associated harmful, potentially harmful impacts if they're not used well. Another issue is that if we're not going to use pesticides, what are we going to do about pest and disease control? A good example would be if you use conservation tillage, then farmers very often depend on using herbicides to control weeds, because of course tillage is a very good way of controlling weeds. If you don't till, then you get more weeding, and otherwise hand weeding or herbicides. So there's very little attention in the discussion of regenerative agriculture is how do we control pests and disease outbreaks if we're not going to use pesticides? And then finally, most of the focus in discussion is very much on the plot or on the farm, with very little consideration of the broader impacts, the broader landscape. If we'd reduce yields on farms, does that lead then to actually an extension of agriculture onto larger areas? So what we call the land sharing, which gives us then a more extensive agriculture, or do we go for land sparing, which is more intensive production on small areas, so that we can leave area alone for nature? And much of my discussion and work with the international arm of WWF is actually focused on land sparing. So the idea of boosting yields in production landscapes to leave aside areas for nature. So we come up in our paper with 5 questions that we would suggest would guide engagement. What's the problem that we're trying to address when we reach to regenerative agriculture or agroecology? So what are we trying to regenerate? What's the problem? How do we regenerate it? What's the mechanism which would enable or facilitate that regeneration? So how do we do it? Fourthly, how can we then make sure that that mechanism is integrated into an agronomic practice like zero-till, cover cropping, which would be viable and economically and socially in that local context? And then finally, what's the broader environment in terms of the political, social, or economic forces which could drive forward the use of that new practice? So these 5 questions. Now I want to skip away for a minute and think about Africa, where I do a lot of work. If you look at this graph, it's quite a complex graph, but we start here at the bottom in 1961. And in 1961, this is where we were in terms of area harvested against cereal yield on the different continents. But since 1961, yields in North America and in Europe have increased enormously, but the area under agriculture has decreased as land has been set aside for nature. In Asia and East and South Asia, we've seen a massive increase in yields. This is the Green Revolution, with not a huge expansion of the land area. In Latin America, we saw an expansion of the land area followed by a massive increase in yields. But in Africa, what we've seen is very little increase in yields, and we've seen production has gone along with population, which has basically increased the area harvested. And what's this led to? This has led to soils being completely exhausted. So this is a slide of mine from Zimbabwe, which is showing then a completely depleted and exhausted soil. So what is really truly regenerative in agriculture? Well, there are two fundamentally renewable resources. One is photosynthesis, the capture of carbon from the air in photosynthesis, which is the basis of all of our food. And the second is then biological nitrogen fixation, the fixation of nitrogen from the air, largely by legumes, which can then be used for crop production. Those are really the two fundamentally renewable resources that we have available. But when we look then at these different principles, so I switch on to agroecology here, which is very similar to regenerative agriculture in many ways, big focus on soil health, biodiversity, etc. We have these 13 principles, one of which is input reduction. But my argument is that when we're in a situation like this, when you see a soil which is so depleted, you can't have sustainable agriculture without increasing inputs. So the idea of input reduction being a general principle simply makes no sense. This is adopted very widely, these principles here, a European association, for instance. So I've worked all of my career on nitrogen-fixing legumes, green manures, grain legumes, agroforestry, legume forages. These are fantastic crops which can fix nitrogen from the air and really give us directly products to eat or to feed to our animals in terms of fodder, and also to boost soil fertility. But these legumes themselves can't work in these very, very poor soils. Here's a green manure on a very poor sandy soil in Zimbabwe, like the one I was showing you. And it really shows that there aren't any silver bullet solutions that work everywhere. In this case, basically, there are not enough nutrients of phosphorus and potassium to allow the crops to grow. So you need some extra inputs in order to build on the biological approach of biological nitrogen fixation. But here we have then European academies advising on regenerative agriculture for the farm to fork and biodiversity studies. Very positive. But against that, a criticism coming up that if we're going to go for this greener Europe, for this farm to fork implications, that could actually lead to reduction of production in Europe. And if we don't reduce the consumption in Europe at the same time, that could kick international food prices up. It could increase food insecurity globally. And particularly, it could have very negative impacts in Africa, which has a fast-growing population and very reliant on food inputs. So in essence, doing things greener in Europe could actually generate increased greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss elsewhere in the world. So we have to recognize we stay and we work in an interconnected world, and one thing we do in one place could have big impacts in another place. And I've written about this as well in what I call grounding the helicopters, is who is actually deciding on the research agenda. And we find very much Europe is now pushing agroecology and regenerative agriculture in Africa, when actually I would argue that there's not enough local determination of what the research priorities are. And when you do talk to local researchers, they're very, very often arguing that they want more inputs, they need more inputs in order to get agriculture going. So finally, a few words on measuring and monitoring. If we're going to go for regenerative agriculture, how do we know? How do we measure and monitor if it's regenerative? And I'm very charmed by an approach which has been used by Unilever in the past under their sustainable agriculture, which is basically a code of practice. It's very wide-ranging, but it focuses on continuous improvement. So they encourage farmers specifically to develop a plan of how they're going to improve on just about every aspect of management across the farm, and then they are monitored against that plan. But there are other self-assessment tools coming up here, one from General Mills to how do a regenerative agriculture self-assessment. But this area of measuring and monitoring remains difficult. There's a lot of emphasis on greenhouse gases, on carbon sequestration and quantifying greenhouse gases so that you can measure your contribution in terms of the broader environment. And this is leading as well then to schemes of carbon farming where farmers are being sold carbon credits. Now, I, for one, and many other scientists are extremely critical of this because we think that these benefits, as I explained earlier, are very much being oversold. But here we are for une agriculture du vivant, from the French here, we are another regenerative index. So there are different ways out there, big focus on soils that people are trying to measure and monitor. But just to finish then, so is regenerative agriculture, is it about science? Is it about marketing? Is it a form of populism? In this cartoon, we have all these people walking up this hill. They get to a place where we need answers, but instead of delving into knowledge and looking for answers to the complex problems we have, they choose for simple statements like we need to do it regeneratively without really thinking about it. They turn and they just walk off the cliff with everybody else. And here we have the people who are saying, no, these are really important problems we need to grapple with. And they grab the book and they walk and they look up and climb this tortuous hill. The world is full of difficult problems that we need to grapple with, and we shouldn't be just going for simplistic approaches. And in the soil science community, this has also been reflected in other science journals about the kiss the ground and make a wish. There's so much attention to soil science now, it becomes a bit like Hollywood, but we need to ground our approach and our understanding in good science and good knowledge and understanding. So to finish, well, regenerative agriculture is here to stay. Everybody's talking about it. So how can we build the positive momentum that's there? And I'd argue that regenerative agriculture is moving the goalposts from what we talked about as sustainable agriculture, which is basically we do things sustainably, we do no harm. It moves it to we should do things better, we should improve. So that's good. I mean, we all can agree on that. We have a lack of a clear definition, but maybe that's better than trying to put in lots of constraints to say you're regenerative, you're not, because it's really about trying to do the best for the environment and for people and for production at the same time. So we can come up with a common set of principles, and we can identify these basic principles of looking at soil and soil health, of trying to engender biodiversity. But the huge diversity of farms and farming systems and the starting points means you have to have a tailored approach for practices. You can't simply say this is the way to do it and do it everywhere. Conservation agriculture, you've discussed, works very well in some places for some farmers some of the time, but not everywhere. So there's nothing that is really the global solution. And finally, measuring and monitoring progress is going to remain a challenge. I'd like to thank these people, Renske, Jens Andersen, Jim Sundberg, and Gabriel Monet as co-authors. And I'd finish by directing you to this website called Table Debates. There's a newsletter there, there's a podcast system, which is basically about getting people to engage in dialogue about global food system debates, about people's views on foods, and how can we actually get good evidence assumptions and look at the values underpinning views on the controversies about food systems. And we try and explore these. We've got a lot of information here on regenerative agriculture, including a discussion I had at one point with people from the Rodale Foundation, which is available as a podcast. And with that, I'd thank you for your attention and look forward to answering questions. So thanks very much.